Their reaction times, the speed of putting launches up, getting launches down, is a direct response to they know how quickly Western forces can actually attack. And they're also changing their tactics. And this has vastly improved their ability to attack precise targets from there. So we're looking now about how Iran has been able to adapt to the war. And there's no question about it that during the course of the war, Iran has shown a remarkable degree of adaptability. But that's a learned lesson. And the learning lesson went right the way back to the conflict last year in June. 12 days of attacks from Israel and America was supposed to be a single knockout blow. It wasn't completely that. A lot of damage was done, but not a knockout blow. But the Iranians learned a huge amount from that. They learned most of all at the kind of strategic and operational level what the Americans and the Israelis or their allies might do, and that's in terms of things like decapitation and trying to strike command nodes and everything that went with that. And so as a result of that, they very rapidly, after the initial attack in February, the very successful initial attack in February that killed Ayatollah Khomeini and many others, as they went into what they call their mosaic of leadership and command and control. So command and control was decentralized down to a regional level, and regional commanders were then given authority to conduct operations, which is why they've been able to survive so successfully. What they were less good at, initially at least, was adapting tactically, and what we're now talking about is the ability for them to adapt tactically. So they were still fairly rigid in how they operated. And what they've learned to do over the course of the campaign, and particularly this kind of on-off campaign, this sort of ceasefire that we're dealing with at the moment, is adapt to that as well. And some of the things we've seen, their reaction times, the speed of putting launches up, getting launches down, is a direct response to they know how quickly Western forces with their excellent satellites and observation can actually attack a launcher. So they're adapting to that as well. And they're also changing their tactics. And the change of tactics has also come about through liaison with the Russians. This has been both technical, in other words, with the Shahed drone, which started, if you remember, as an Iranian drone, and was then exported to Russia, and the Russians then used it against the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians learned to counter it. The Russians have then adapted it, and there's been some exchange of information between Russia and Iran on how to update the drones in order to be more effective, and they've done that. They've also made good use of Russian intelligence, and the Russians, of course, denied this. It's almost certain that the targeting, the very precise targeting against specific infrastructure targets in the American bases, has been very much guided by the Russians themselves. Whether that's formal targeting in the sense of giving the exact grid references or just using the equipment that they had in order to be more effective is less clear. But there's no question about it. There's been a strong link with Russia, and this has vastly improved their ability to attack precise targets from there. Whether it represents a kind of long-term operational advantage to Iran is probably more moot, because the other thing, of course, that's happening the whole time is the Americans and Israelis and the Emiratis and the Saudis, Omanis, all the other people that the Iranians have been attacking have also been learning. And so what we have is a very standard kind of sort of dynamic in war, whereby one side learns from the other. You adapt in the first instance to survive their attacks, and sometimes to be able to turn them to your advantage. And that's the dynamic we can see at play at the moment. Where I say that the Iranians have the advantage over America at the moment and some of its allies is their ability to use the kind of economic leverage of the Strait of Hormuz. And this not only has a direct effect on the incomes and well-being of the countries affected, but also has a global implication, and that puts a kind of point of pressure on there. So effectively, the Iranians have learned, and they've learned both tactically, but they've also learned through their sort of decentralized command and control, their control of economic leverage, and some tactical advantages that they've managed to gain to contain the American attacks and get to the point, or a bit like the way in which the Ukrainians did versus the Russians, whereby they can survive. And if you think about it in some regime strategic terms, for Iran, this war is a war of survival. This is a war of existential war. In other words, the existence of the Iranian Republican Guard state has got to continue as far as they're concerned. And what they've adapted over time to get to is a place where they can pretty well keep this going for as long as they wish. Yes, they'll always be at a disadvantage militarily. Yes, the Americans will always be able to kind of strike pretty well at will wherever they want to be. But will it fundamentally alter the balance of power? Unless the Americans are prepared to go one stage further, the chances are not. Yes, if the Americans decide to put boots on the ground within a limited way for something like Karg Island or some of the kind of the coastal areas, that would make a difference. Or if they went towards what we might call economic military targets, for example, infrastructure, then that would also have an effect as well. But again, the Iranians would respond. I mean, one of their major points of pressure, the areas where they've been most successful, has been what's known as horizontal escalation, whereby they've lashed out at countries like Kuwait, like Bahrain, like Oman, and attacked not just their military targets there or places where the Americans have been basing, but they've attacked oil refineries, they've attacked water plants. These are absolutely essential kind of life-giving infrastructure for those countries, and that is another point of pressure which they've been prepared to do. And so far, that's not really been reciprocated for by the Americans. Right at the end of the main bit of the war, there was one attack on a small town on the water supply of a small town, which also had a major base in it as well, and that really was a kind of demonstration by the Americans, say, look, we can do this. There's a town of about 10,000 people, and effectively they cut the water for them. It was basically a demonstration by the Americans that they could conduct that. But unless they're prepared to go to that stage and have large-scale infrastructure attacks on Iran, then it's very hard to see how this continued campaign of marginal attrition of Iranian military capabilities and then the Iranians striking back couldn't, frankly, continue for a great long time in the future. I think this is one of the things that, like a lot of post-war claims, the truth was very hard to get out. I mean, I recall after studying after the Second World War, there were whole studies trying to demonstrate how effective or ineffective strategic bombing had been. And I suspect the answer we'll probably find is that the bombing was effective. Indeed, a lot of it's been very, very effective. But the kind of rather over-the-top, grandiose claims, particularly from President Trump, that they basically destroyed their capabilities, I think probably turned out to be, should we say, less than true from that was there. Undoubtedly, huge amount of damage has been done. There's no question about that. But the idea that whole categories of weapon systems have been completely eliminated, I think, is a false statement, I'm afraid. So they've been written down, a lot of attrition going on, but they haven't been completely defeated. And again, the lesson they've been learning from kind of years of studying how the Americans might attack them is they've also did things like disperse their production facilities. So Iranian arms production has also been dispersed in the same way as their command and control systems have been dispersed. And so it's less efficient. It's actually also quite a good lesson for someone like ourselves in terms of how you build up resilience. You know, you have to disperse. You put everything in one place, and then a single bomb can then destroy your entire manufacturing system. So they haven't. They've accepted the kind of the efficiency penalties and have dispersed their engineering as well. And some of the stuff that we're talking about, things like the Shahed drones, are relatively unsophisticated, but they're not. Just call them complete. They're not crude. They know what they do, but they're relatively unsophisticated. So a reasonable level of kind of competence can produce them and keep them going. And so on that basis, they'd be able to continue to develop. And they've also been reinforced. We know they've had MANPADS, which is man-portable air defense systems, have been given to them by Russia and from China. And I said when we talked earlier, we know that the Shahed drones have also been improved coming from there. So as part of their kind of survival strategy, as part of their adapt to survive strategy, they've also they have been able to maintain a level of capability which perhaps has surprised some commentators, having looked at the kind of whole awe, majesty and might of the US and occasionally Israeli Air Force attacks on Iran as well. So that's also part of the picture. I don't know how many times in this particular ceasefire we've been in the last chance saloon. I mean, I've kind of given up counting how many times we've been there. I think what it does tell you, perhaps more profoundly, is the kind of the challenges of dealing with the Iranian regime. And the Iranian regime is a very strange organisation. We don't really recognise it, I suppose, in our own kind of political understanding. You've got a thing that actually doesn't look so dissimilar from Western liberal democracy, with parliaments, with a kind of formal government, with a foreign ministry, and all those sorts of elements. And you have this separate parallel government, effectively, with the IRGC in charge. And as a result of the war, the IRGC is increasingly in charge from there. So you could have both statements can be true. So in the morning, an Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman can say, we think a deal is possible on the Straits of Hormuz, and we're prepared to open negotiations on the denuclearization for military purposes of Iran. And then come the afternoon, when the IRGC to leadership get hold of that statement, it can be utterly denied. And I think that's the honest truth about it. So we kind of poke fun at some of the statements that perhaps President Trump makes, and that's it. But actually, there is a house divided, and we could see this right the way back to the very beginning of the negotiations that took place. One of the great surprises the Pakistani has had was a number of Iranian delegates that turned up. I mean, over 70 turned up. I think the Americans had 3 or 4 with a few staffers, but it was a real shock. This plane arrived, and 70 members of the delegation all turned up, all of whom had to be looked after, all of whom were basically part of the delegation. And they effectively represented all the various factions that existed in Iran. So the Americans and the Pakistanis and the Qataris, who were the interlocutors, were essentially dealing with the whole factionalism of Iran, which of course made it very hard to make a kind of deal with them from there. But do I think a deal is easy? I don't think it necessarily is. I mean, the Iranians have discovered they always had, but as a distinct point of leverage with the Straits of Hormuz, and they'll be very reluctant to give it all up. There may well be a kind of intermediate position that can be taken with some control through the Straits, some levies going through the Straits, and so that's all possible. But they are very reluctant to go back to the situation that existed before, where it was treated just purely and simply as an international waterway through which everyone had innocent right of passage, which is indeed the correct legal position for it under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's what's called a strait, and innocent passage is allowed through. So they're going to be very reluctant to go back to that from there. They're still talking, for example, of not allowing what they call unfriendly vessels to pass through. Well, that rather puts us kibosh on the US 6th Fleet, which is based in Bahrain. So that's going to be a kind of non-starter as far as the Americans are concerned. They will demand innocent right of passage through there as part of the position. They'll also look very hard at the issue around nuclear weapons. I mean, the Iranians have perhaps correctly drawn the conclusion that America does not attack nuclear-powered states, however unfriendly they are, and it can see that in places like Korea, and everything goes to that, and so it would be very reluctant to give up its aspirations towards that. I mean, they will claim that they were kind of in a position where they could make it rather than not make it. I don't think that's a very satisfactory position for us, and certainly I wouldn't trust them. I think if they had the chance to create a nuclear weapon, they would do so. Now, it would automatically change alter the basis of security in the Middle East. So these really tricky issues, I think, remain. I think there's probably if you like, a more stable form of ceasefire available. In terms of negotiations, in terms of conversation between the two sides, but whether this could turn in the short term into a kind of long-term sustainable peace, I think is still a moot point. In which case, I suspect we're going to see, as I said before, more and more visits to the last chance saloon, and with everything that goes with that. So negotiations break down. Some regional commander then conducts an attack on an American ship or an innocent ship trying to pass through the Straits of Hormuz. That provokes a reaction. We have another bout of reaction, counter-reaction, and fighting, and then another attempt to broker a peace. So I think we're a long way yet from a sustainable peace. Whether this particular round of negotiations turns into anything more sustainable, I think is possible, but I think is moot would be perhaps the correct word to describe it. The issue of whether either side escalates, I think, is also very interesting. It's not really in the US's interests to escalate unless they absolutely have to. I mean, their options really are threefold. One is continue this kind of path of diplomacy with its kind of rather rocky road of ceasefire violations and responses. The second option is walk away. Just literally kind of walk away, dust it off and say, look, we tried, can't do anything about it. But that would have massive geopolitical implications in terms of the US position, not just in the region, but worldwide. It would be a comprehensive strategic failure in a way that perhaps their withdrawal from Vietnam wasn't. But this really would be, because the Gulf and everything that goes with it is of absolutely vital sort of interest in terms of the world's economy. So I think walking away is not an option, but it does exist on the table. And the third option is go all in, a kind of massive build-up of forces, and then some form of intervention, probably a limited intervention, but some form of intervention involving, again, not just airstrikes, sea strikes, but actually this time troops on the ground, perhaps take some limited objectives in order to put pressure on the regime. So those are the options. None are very attractive from that perspective. What does Iran want? Iran basically wants to survive. So they don't need to beat the Americans. They don't need to defeat them. They don't need to do that. All they need to do is basically to survive. So at the end of whatever this process is, if the IRGC-backed regime survives, they can count that as a victory. It leaves the region very unstable, and a lot of people really angry, with not just with the Iranians, but perhaps also with the Americans, for not seeing the whole thing through. But maybe seeing the whole thing through with Iran is an ask too far, and not possible. There could be some subsets of this, including, for example, the removal of the proxy forces, the Houthis, the Hamas and Hezbollah, and seeing them taken out of the picture. That might continue. But for Iran, what they're looking for is regime survival. And I think we just need to be really clear with Iran, is that, again, we treat it like a kind of rational actor. The way in which it behaves is similar to the way in which you and I would think. It's a kind of it's an ugly form of chess. But this isn't really how they see things. At the heart of the regime, they have got this ideological obsessions, ideological belief that they represent a very pure form of Islam. And for them, martyrdom, even destruction, is written into the code of this particular regime. That makes it a very difficult regime to deal with, because if you're not frightened of physical death, and you actually welcome the idea of martyrdom, then rational calculus is perhaps less useful than kind of like emotional intelligence, psychological intelligence, and understanding the kind of opponent we're dealing with. And that's who we're dealing with. It's not just about, as I say, a rather deadly form of chess. There's something else going on there. And I think in some respects, we're ill-equipped to understand and to deal with it.